The room was cold and dark and full of smoke from the burning lights above. The metal floor was wet and smelled like old blood and rust and fear. A soft voice cried from the corner, but no one cared, and no one looked. The auction was starting, and the crowd was growing, and the aliens were hungry. They came from many planets and many systems, and they all wanted one thing. They wanted her, the girl with silver eyes and soft skin, and long white hair that glowed under the light. She was not human. But she was not like them either. She was rare and young and beautiful and perfect for pleasure. They whispered about her value and laughed and made dirty jokes. She stood there in silence with her hands chained and her face down. Her body trembled. But her eyes burned with something more than fear. She had no name and no hope and no choice. Auctioneer stepped forward and raised his hand and shouted in a loud voice, "Today we sell the finest prize from the outer colonies, young and untouched, and obedient and trained for service. Who will start the bid?" A green-skinned alien in armor lifted his claw and shouted his price. Another alien with 3 eyes laughed and shouted higher. The crowd roared and clapped, and the girl closed her eyes. Then a sound came from the door, a slow sound like metal boots on the floor. Everyone turned and stared. A tall man entered wearing a long black coat and a cold expression. He was human, the only one in the room. The auctioneer looked at him and smirked. "You are far from Earth, my friend. This place is not for weak things like you." The man said nothing. He walked forward and looked at the girl. His eyes were calm, but sharp like a blade. The crowd laughed again. A soft voice said, "He is lost or drunk." Another said, "Maybe he wants to die." The man looked at the auctioneer and spoke, "She is not for sale." The room went quiet. The auctioneer blinked. "Excuse me." The man said again in a slow voice, "She is not for sale." The auctioneer smiled and raised his hand again. "You do not have credits and you do not have power. Walk away before you are broken." Still the man did not move. He looked at the girl and said in a voice like steel, "No one touches you unless you want it." The green-skinned alien growled and moved toward the girl. He raised his hand to grab her hair. In the blink of an eye the human moved. No one saw what happened. 1 second the alien was standing, and the next second he was on the floor, his neck twisted and his eyes wide and his mouth open, but no sound came out. The crowd gasped. The girl looked up with wide eyes. The human stood between her and the others like a wall. The auctioneer shouted, "You dare attack a guest, you will be hunted." The man said, "I do not care." He turned to the girl and slowly reached for her chains. She did not move. He broke the chains with a small device from his belt. Her hands were free for the first time in years. She stared at her wrists like they were not hers. Then she looked at him. Why? "Did you save me?" The man looked away for a moment, then back at her. "Because no one saved my daughter." Alarms began to ring. Red lights flashed on the walls. Guards shouted in alien tongues. The crowd started to move back. Weapons came out, and doors locked. The auctioneer screamed, "He is a threat. He must die." The man picked the girl up in his arms. She was light like a feather. She whispered again. "I do not understand." He said nothing. He walked toward the exit with slow steps and calm eyes. Lasers flashed around him, but none touched him. The girl buried her face in his chest and tears fell from her silver eyes. She was not crying from fear. She was crying because for the first time someone saw her. Someone heard her. Someone cared. And as they walked through the fire and smoke and hate, a voice whispered from the speaker above, "Intruder is human. He must be stopped. He must be destroyed." But the human kept walking, and the girl kept holding on, and for the first time she felt free. The door burst open with a loud sound and smoke filled the hallway like a wave of fire and shadow. The human stepped through without fear, and the girl clung to his chest like a fragile leaf in the storm. Behind them the alarms screamed like dying machines, and the angry voices of guards echoed like thunder. He did not stop, and he did not turn, and he did not speak. His eyes looked forward, and his legs moved fast and sure, like he had walked this road before. The girl could hear his heart like a drum, and feel his breath steady and warm like shelter in winter. They reached the lower halls where the walls were old and rusted, and the lights flickered like dying stars. The girl asked him with a soft voice, "Where are we going?" and he answered with no sound. Only a glance. She looked at him and saw something deep in his eyes. Not cold, not cruel, but something quiet and heavy, like a secret that hurt too long. She looked away and held tighter. She had no idea where they were going or what waited beyond the smoke, but she trusted him without reason. Behind them, footsteps came loud and fast. Alien voices shouted orders and weapons charged with buzzing sounds. The human reached a corner and stopped for the first time. He set the girl down and pulled a small device from his coat. The walls around them began to shift like they were alive. He had opened a secret passage hidden behind the rust and metal. He motioned her in, and she obeyed without question. They moved into the narrow space, and the door closed behind like it was never there. Darkness surrounded them, and the air smelled like oil and dust. The girl felt fear rise again, but the human moved forward with steady steps. She followed close behind, listening to his breathing like it was a song of hope. She asked in a whisper, "Who are you?" and he answered after a long silence, "A father." That word hung in the air like a stone. She wanted to ask more, but his tone told her not now, not yet. The tunnel led them to an old cargo bay. Inside were broken crates and old machines covered in webs and silence. The human walked to a terminal and placed his hand on the screen. Lights came alive and a voice spoke in a soft tone, "Welcome back, Commander." The girl looked at him with wide eyes. He ignored her and worked the controls with fast fingers and sharp focus. A door opened, and inside was a small ship with scars and dust, but still whole and ready. He turned to her and spoke fast and clear. "We fly now." She nodded and stepped into the ship with a strange feeling in her chest, a mix of fear and hope, and something she had never felt before. She sat down and looked around as the ship came alive with light and sound. The human sat at the controls, and the ship began to rise outside. The doors of the bay exploded as the guards found them again. Shots fired and smoke poured in, but the ship pushed forward like a beast waking from sleep. They broke through the roof and flew into the red sky. The city below screamed and flamed like a broken machine. She looked out and saw towers and chains and smoke that never stopped. This world had kept her in chains, but now it was below her and fading fast. The human kept flying higher and faster as ships followed and weapons locked on. She asked with panic, "Will they catch us?" He said, "Not if I kill the engines," and dropped like a rock. She stared and then saw him do exactly that. The ship fell like a star from the sky, and the enemy lost sight. At the last second, the engines came back and they shot into deep space like a ghost. Silence returned, but her heart still raced. She looked at him, and he finally looked back. He said, "Your name?" She shook her head. "I do not have one." He nodded once and looked away. He said nothing else, but she saw his hands tremble for a moment. The stars stretched before them like roads with no end. The girl sat quiet, but her mind moved fast. She was free but lost, safe but confused. She turned to him and asked, "Why did you come for me?" He said nothing for a long time. Then, with a soft voice, he said, "Because no one came for my daughter. She was taken and sold, and I was too late. So now I make sure I am not too late again." The girl felt something inside her shift like a door opening. She was still scared and hurt, but now there was a spark, not just safety but purpose, not just escape but meaning. And as the ship moved through the stars and the past fell behind, she closed her eyes and whispered one word: hope. The stars outside the ship moved slow like rivers of light in a sea of black. Inside the small ship, silence wrapped around them like a blanket heavy with memory. The human sat at the front with eyes fixed on the endless dark and hands steady on the controls. The girl sat behind him, watching his back and trying to understand the man who saved her. She wanted to speak, but her throat was tight like something heavy was stuck inside. He had not said much since the escape, and his face stayed calm but distant. She looked at her own hands and saw the faded marks of chains and bruises not yet healed. Her body was free, but her mind still felt trapped in rooms full of pain and eyes full of hunger. She took a slow breath and stood and walked closer and sat beside him without a word. He did not stop her and did not speak. She looked at him and asked soft and slow, "Why did you come to that place?" He kept looking forward, and his voice came like wind through trees low and dry. "I heard a signal. I followed it. It was not meant for me, but I listened anyway." She asked again what was in the signal. He looked at her, and his eyes showed a storm hidden behind stone. "A voice," he said, "a voice begging, not screaming, not angry, just begging to be seen." I knew that voice, not the sound but the pain. It was the same voice I heard in my sleep for years. It was my daughter's voice, but not her words. She looked down and felt her heart twist. The way he spoke, the way his voice cracked without breaking, told her everything. She wanted to ask more but did not know how. She touched the wall beside her and felt the cold metal and let her thoughts move like slow waves. He said, "Your chains were not just metal, they were silence. They made you forget your own voice." She turned to him and nodded slowly. "They made me forget my name," she said. "They told me I was nothing. They told me I was property. I believed them for a long time." He looked at her and said, "I believed the same when they took my child. I believed I was too weak, too late, too lost. But pain teaches in strange ways. Pain either kills you or makes you fight." She asked, "What happened to your daughter?" His hands tightened on the controls, and his voice went quiet again. "I searched for years," he said. "I broke rules and burned bridges and became something I never wanted to be. I found where she had been, but not where she went. I found only empty rooms and broken chains and silence." She closed her eyes and saw her own memories. The cages, the auctions, the cold hands, the fake smiles, the nights full of fear. She opened her mouth and let the story come out, not all at once, but piece by piece. She told him about the day she was taken. She was with her mother near the village edge. The sky turned red, and the ships came down like shadows with teeth. They took her and left the others in smoke and blood. She told him how they trained her, how they gave her a number instead of a name, how they told her to smile when she felt pain, how they punished her when she cried, how they sold her over and over, how they never saw her as anything more than a thing. She told him how she stopped speaking, how she stopped thinking, how she stopped dreaming, until the day he came and said, "No one touches you unless you want." I listened without moving, his jaw tight and his eyes full of fire hidden deep inside. When she stopped speaking, the ship was still and space around them was quiet like the world had paused. He said, "You are not a thing, not anymore, not ever again." She reached for his hand and he did not pull away. They sat like that for a moment, both broken in different ways, both survivors of a world that chews and spits and forgets. But in that silence they found something, not healing, not yet, but truth. She said, "I do not want to be afraid anymore." He said, "You will be afraid sometimes, but now you have a choice. That is what freedom means." She looked at him and saw not a warrior or a savior, but a father who lost too much and still chose to fight. He looked at her and saw not a victim or a rescued girl, but a spark that refused to die. The ship moved forward, slow but sure, through stars and silence and sorrow. Two souls carrying pain but also carrying each other, and somewhere deep inside, a voice began to return, not the voice of chains or orders or fear, but her own, quiet at first, but growing stronger. Asterisk. The ship landed on a dead moon where the sun never touched the ground and the sky stayed gray like old ash. The place was called the Market of Bones, not because of stories, but because of truth. Bones were everywhere, in walls and floors, in the air like dust. It was not a place for hope or peace or safety. It was a place where the broken came to survive and the cruel came to rule. The human stepped out first, his coat brushing against the wind that carried old screams. The girl followed close, her feet touching cracked stone, her eyes watching every shadow. No one welcomed them, no one asked questions, no one smiled in this place. Silence was safer than kindness, and eyes could cut deeper than knives. They walked through narrow paths, between metal huts and broken towers. Every corner held danger, every turn hid a secret. But the human walked with purpose, as if he had walked these paths in dreams or in nightmares. He passed by beggars with empty eyes, by traders with blood on their hands, by hunters with trophies of flesh. None dared stop him, but all watched him and whispered behind broken teeth. The girl saw children with wires instead of arms, and women with chains around their thoughts. She felt the past try to pull her back into the dark. But she looked at the human and kept walking because his shadow was stronger than her fear. They reached a large hall where smoke rose from fires and machines sang songs of greed. Inside the hall was a man not quite human, not quite machine, with one eye glowing red. His name was Varn, and he once fought beside the human in wars that history forgot. Now he sold parts and people and anything with a price. The human walked to him and said, "I need a ship with stealth and fuel, and a path out of this system." Varn laughed with a sound like breaking glass and said, "The galaxy wants your head, old friend. You bring death wherever you go." The human said, "I only bring death to those who earn it." Varn looked at the girl and smiled with teeth too sharp, and said, "She will fetch a high price if you change your mind." The girl stepped back, but the human did not move. He said, "She is not for sale, and never will be." Varn shrugged and said, "Everything here is for sale, even your silence, even your soul." But he turned and pressed a code into a console, and a map appeared on the wall. He pointed and said, "Take this path, avoid the blue suns, watch for the red ships, and trust no one." The human nodded and placed a small cube on the table. "Payment enough," said Varn, with a grin that never reached his eyes. The human turned to leave and the girl followed. But something in the shadows moved. A figure stepped out with a gun and a smile that spoke of betrayal. It was Cray, a mercenary once saved by the human, now sold to greed. He said, "You should not have come here, old ghost. The bounty on your head is worth 1,000 lives." The girl froze, and the crowd in the hall moved back like waves before a storm. The human said, "I gave you life once, and now you throw it away." Cray said, "Life is cheap, but credit is gold." He raised his gun, but the girl moved first. She picked up a shard of metal from the floor and threw it with all her pain and rage and memory. The shard struck Cray's hand, and the gun fell, and the crowd gasped. The human moved next, and in one breath, Cray was on the ground, silent and broken. The hall stayed quiet for a moment. Then Varn laughed again and said, "Perhaps not everything can be bought." The girl stood shaking her chest, rising with each breath like a storm breaking inside. The human looked at her, and for the first time he smiled, not with joy, but with pride. He said, "Sometimes fighting back is the only way to stay human." They left the hall and returned to the ship with fuel and maps and fire in their hearts. The girl sat in her seat with hands still trembling but eyes wide open. She asked him, "Why did you let me act first?" He said, "Because you are not weak, and you are not my shadow. You are your own light." The ship rose from the moon, and the market of bones faded into gray dust. But the memory stayed, the lesson stayed, the strength stayed. Stars waited for them. The road was still long and full of war. But now she had more than freedom. She had choice, she had power, and she was ready to use it. The stars burned cold above a dark planet, with rings like knives and winds that sang of death. The ship moved quiet between shadows, hiding from eyes that searched with hate and hunger inside. The ship's silence held them like a secret wrapped in metal and fire. The girl sat near the window, watching the stars pass like ghosts with no name. The human stood at the controls, eyes locked on a screen where red dots blinked like warnings in blood. He said nothing, but his jaw was tight and his breath slow like a man walking toward a storm. He cannot stop, the girl asked, "What is wrong?" And he answered with two words that turned her blood to ice. "He is here." She had never heard that voice in him before, not fear, not anger, but something deeper, something sharp and cold. She asked who, and the ship shook as if the sky answered for him. The screen flashed and one red dot moved faster than the others. The human pressed buttons and pulled levers, and the ship turned. But the red dot kept coming. She asked again, "Who is he?" And the human looked at her with eyes full of war. He said, "His name is Threx, and he does not stop in the days of the old war." Threx was called the Silent Blade. He hunted generals, spies, kings, anyone with a name, and left no voice behind. He was not just a killer, he was a message that power can wear a smile and still bleed you dry. The Girl felt the weight of that name like chains returning from the past. She asked, "Why is he chasing us?" The human said, "Because you are free. And that makes you dangerous." The ship moved fast through clouds of dust and fields of ice. But the red light behind them did not fade. Threx flew a hunter-class vessel made of shadow and speed. It could smell fear and follow silence and kill before breath could return. The human looked at the girl and said, "You must learn to run before you learn to fight." She shook her head and said, "I already learned to run. Now I want to learn to stand." He nodded once and handed her a device small and silver. With a blinking light, he said, "Press this if I fall, and the ship will take you somewhere safe." She said, "I will not leave you." He said, "You must if it means you live." The ship shook again, and lights blinked red and walls screamed from the impact. Threx had found them. The human opened a hatch and pulled out weapons not made for beauty, but for truth. He gave one to the girl and said, "It listens to your will, not your hand. Aim with your spirit, not your fear." They stood together as the enemy ship clamped onto theirs like a beast's sinking teeth. The walls groaned and the air turned cold as the door opened with a hiss that felt like death. Threx stepped in, tall and silent, dressed in black armor that looked alive. His face was hidden behind a mask with no eyes, no mouth, no mercy. He raised one hand and pointed at the girl and said nothing. Human stepped between them and said, "If you want her, you go through me." Threx moved like a shadow and the fight began. Blades clashed and sparks flew, and the ship rocked with every strike. The girl watched and felt the pull to run, but her feet stayed and her hands gripped the weapon tight. The human fought with fire in his blood, but Threx moved like wind without soul. Every move was perfect, every strike was planned. The human blocked one attack, but missed the next. Blood hit the floor, and the girl screamed, but he stayed on his feet. He shouted, "Go now, press the device." She said no, and raised the weapon with shaking arms and burning eyes. She aimed with her pain and fired with her will. The light hit Threx and his armor cracked, but he did not fall. He turned to her now, and the mask looked straight through her bones. Human used that moment and drove his blade deep into Threx's side. Hunter stumbled back for the first time in years. He said no word. He only turned and vanished in smoke. The ship shook again, and warnings filled the air. The human leaned against the wall, blood running down his side. The girl held him and said, "Do not close your eyes." He smiled weak and said, "You stood." She said, "I will stand," again and again. Pulled away from the hunter ship and flew into the black. The stars returned, but the silence was different. Now it held not just fear but strength. Girl sat beside the human and wrapped his wound with care. He said, "You are not the same girl I found in chains." She said, "And you are not the same man who walked alone." The ship flew on into the unknown. Behind them a hunter watched from the dark. Ahead of them a world waited where freedom would be tested again. But for now they rested in the space between past and promise. And the fire in her chest burned brighter than any star asterisk. The ship drifted near a golden planet with rings like fire and clouds, like silk spun by dreams. From above it looked gentle and quiet, like peace waiting to be touched. The girl watched it through the glass, her hands pressed against the window, her heart beating fast with something that felt like hope. The human stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes sharp like steel that refused to rust. He said, "This place is called Elyon. It is a free world, or so they claim." She turned and asked, "Do you believe that?" He said, "I do not believe anything until it tries to kill me or save me." She nodded and said, "Maybe this time is different." He did not answer. They landed near a city made of glass and silver, and voices that laughed without fear. People walked in the sun wearing soft clothes and easy smiles. No chains, no guns, no screams. Just air that felt light and roads that shimmered like water on stone. They stepped from the ship, and no one stared, no one whispered, no one pointed. A woman in white robes greeted them with a smile that reached her eyes and said, "Welcome to Elyon. We heard your signal. We offer sanctuary." The girl looked at the human and then back at the woman and said, "We have run far and long." The woman touched her hand and said, "Then you may rest." Now they were taken to a house on a hill where wind danced Through open windows and the walls smelled like flowers, not metal, the girl walked barefoot, on warm floors and touched walls that did not hum with pain. She slept in a bed with real pillows and soft light, not blinking warnings. She woke to birds, not alarms. For the first time she did not flinch at her own reflection. The human stayed silent and watched everything with the eyes of a soldier who never stopped fighting. He listened to every sound, every footstep, every silence that came too quick. He walked the city at night, counting exits, counting guards, counting lies. The girl met others who had escaped from places like hers. They sat in circles and shared stories like old songs, and their eyes held tears, but also fire. She spoke to not as a victim, but as a voice. She said pain is a chain, but truth is a blade. She said I was sold, but not broken. She said I was touched, but not erased. And they listened and cried and held her hand. The woman in white watched her with pride and kindness. She said, you are strong, you could help others here, you could stay. The girl asked the human, what should I do? He said, I cannot tell you. She asked, will you stay? He said, I do not belong in places that dream of peace. She looked at him and her heart felt torn like pages ripped from two books. He had saved her and taught her and stood with her, but he never promised forever. She asked, are you leaving? He said, not yet, but soon. She nodded and walked away before the tears fell. That night the stars blinked in silence. The wind was still, but the air felt wrong. Human stood outside the house, staring at the hills beyond the city. He felt it not in the sky, but in his bones. The kind of silence that hides a knife. He turned back and ran inside. The house was dark, the walls too quiet. He found the girl sitting in a chair, her hands shaking, her eyes wide. She said, they came to me in the night. They said I am special. They said I could be useful. He said, what did you say? She said, I told them. No, he said, good. But his face stayed hard. In the morning the woman in white returned, but her eyes were colder, and her smile was too smooth. She said, we can offer you safety, but freedom is expensive. She said, we must ask you to join our cause. Your abilities could help us build something greater. The human said, she owes you nothing. The woman said, all life must pay. The girl stood and said, I will not trade one cage for another. Guards stepped in with soft steps and empty eyes. The girl stepped back, but the human moved first. He said, I warned you. And then the quiet broke. The house became smoke and the sky lit with fire. The girl grabbed the bag they packed days ago and followed the man who never stopped walking. They ran through streets that now showed their teeth. People watched but did not move. Some cried, but none helped. Hope is a lie when built on silence and fear. They reached the ship with burns on their clothes and blood on their hands. The girl looked back once and saw the woman in white standing in the flames. No anger, no regret, just stillness, like a statue built on lies. The human started the engines, and the ship rose with a scream like rage breaking free. The girl sat down beside him and said, you were right. He said, I did not want to be. She said, I thought I could stop running. He said, now you know how to run and how to fight. Soon you will know how to win. The stars opened again, cold and wide. Elian vanished behind them like a mask torn from a monster, and the fire in her chest burned not for peace, but for war. The stars no longer looked silent. They looked like watchers, like witnesses, like eyes waiting for the end of a long breath. The ship moved through deep space with lights dimmed, engines low, like a hunter crouched in the dark. Inside the ship, the girl stood near the mirror, not to see beauty, not to fix her hair, not to hide her scars. She stood to look at herself, not as a number, not as a slave, not as a lost thing. She stood to see the warrior she had become and the storm she now carried. In her chest, the human sat at the console with fingers resting on controls and eyes locked on a red signal blinking slow and steady. He said, the final door is open, the place that started it, all is waiting for us. The girl turned and said, then we walk in and burn it to the ground. He nodded once, no smile, no words, just understanding. They had learned that the people behind Elian were the same ones behind the auction, same hands, same greed, same lies. A web of control wrapped in kindness, painted with peace but soaked in chains. She had once been trapped in that system, now she would tear it apart. The ship reached a black station hidden between two dead moons. No stars shined near it, no signals left from it. It was made of dark stone and metal, like bones carved from old gods. The girl stepped into her armor, light and strong, shaped to move with her breath. The human wore his old gear, patched and scarred, and full of stories. Too heavy to carry, they walked together through the airlock and onto the station with no fear, only fire. The halls were empty, but not silent. Cameras watched vents, breathed walls, pulsed like a beast half asleep. They moved without sound until they reached the heart of it. A room full of machines and faces, and chain screens lit up, and a voice spoke, smooth and hollow like silk wrapped around rot. "You have come far," said the voice, "but you cannot win. We do not use weapons, we use want. We do not take, we offer. We do not chain, we promise." The girl stepped forward and said, "You promised safety and gave cages. You promised peace and sold bodies. You promised future and burned souls." The voice said they agreed. She said, "I never did." A dozen guards stepped into the room, tall, strong, dressed in white. They pointed weapons, but did not fire. They were waiting for fear. She gave them rage. She moved like a storm, fast, sharp, without pause. She struck first, not to kill, but to break the wall of silence. They fired, but she dodged. They chased, but she turned. And when they thought they had her, the human moved through them like smoke through cracks together. They broke the line and reached the core. The voice screamed now, not calm, not smooth, just rage and hate and fear. "You will destroy order," it said. "You will bring chaos." The human said, "We will bring truth." He placed charges on the core. She hacked the doors. She unlocked the names. Every child, every slave, every silent voice stored in files and chains. Now free, now seen, now known. The station began to shake as alarms wailed and lights died. The voice begged now, no more lies, no more masks, only panic. "We can make a deal," it said. She said, "We already did, and you broke it." The human pulled her toward the exit as fire crawled through the halls. She looked back once, not to mourn, not to regret, but to remember. They reached the ship and launched as the station behind them cracked and split and fell. Not just metal breaking, not just fire spreading, but a system dying in space. There was no sound, but in her heart there was a roar. She sat down and closed her eyes and let herself feel not fear, not doubt, but power, the kind that comes when you take back what was stolen. The human looked at her and saw not the girl from the auction, not the girl from the cage. He saw the leader. The fire, the voice. She opened her eyes and said, "We go back now." He said, "Back where?" She said, "To every place they think they still own. We free them all." He smiled, not wide, not bright, but true. "Then we begin again," he said. The ship moved into the stars. Not to run, not to hide, not to wait. It moved like a blade, with a name, with a purpose, with a promise. No more chains, no more cages, no more silence. The galaxy would know her name, not as a number, not as a price, not as a whisper, but as fire that would never die.